We're very privileged to have with us a global traveller who is a journalist, urbanist and speaker. He's a contributing writer for Fast Company and an author of the international best-selling book Aerotropolis, The Way We Will Live Next. It has a beautiful, very colourful cover on it, but I can guarantee the content is very substantial, very enlightening, and very futurist. Greg Lindsay is our guest. He speaks frequently about globalization, innovation, and the future of cities. And you'll see in your program, he's recently spoken at some very eminent institutions, including the London School of Economics, Institute for the Future, Intel Labs, Museum of Modern Art, the World Policy Institute, Asia Society, Columbia University, and the first Clark Aviation Conference. He's an expert on the future of travel, technology, and urbanism. Please join me in welcoming Greg Lindsay.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you all for coming. I hope you're enjoying the conference so far. You've heard, the name of this conference is Clark, Asia's next Aerotropolis. Well, we haven't discussed what an Aerotropolis is or the Aerotropolises that do exist. And so would you mind lowering the lights, please, by the way? I hope to see the slides. And so I'm here to basically speak to you and describe what the Aerotropolis is and put it into context, this incredible revolution in aviation that's happening worldwide, and why basically the cities of tomorrow, at least some of them, and some of the most important ones, will be built in relation to their airports. This quote by former President Lee Myung-bak of South Korea: "If the 20th century was the era of nations, then the 21st century belongs to cities." This has been formulated many times in many ways, but the notion of it is that the 20th century belonged to the nation state, the Cold War, empires battling out and being dismantled into smaller nations, the realm of warfare and politics, which we're still seeing the legacy of going on right now in the South China Sea. But the real future belongs to cities. The city is the element. It's the place where innovation happens. It's the place where growth happens. It's where jobs are created. It's where we live our lives. And increasingly, it is where humanity will live. More than half of humanity now lives in cities as of a few years ago. And by the middle of this century, by 2050, as many as 80% of humanity, 7 billion people, will live in a city. So we have not yet begun to build the cities of tomorrow. There's an estimate that urban land cover will triple in the next 40 years. We need hundreds of new cities around the globe. And so we need to figure out ways in which to build them. What will we build them around? What industries? What locations? And so I would argue, and this is what President Lee Myung-bak was referring to, is, we have always built locations of transportation and trade. As Jane Jacobs, the great American urbanist, pointed out, trade was the impetus for cities, where we meet strangers, bring them together, meet face to face, and exchange ideas and goods and money. And so this, I think, is still the defining characteristic of cities and the cities we will build. And it was interesting that this quote, why I quote former President Lee Myung-bak, is because I was there when he said it. We were there at the opening day of a new city being built from scratch off the coast of Korea, arguably Asia's first Aerotropolis. This is Songdo. It was mentioned earlier by one of our panelists. It's a $35 billion city being built from scratch in the Yellow Sea on a man-made island south of the airport. It's designed to be the size of, roughly a Philippine equivalent, perhaps Fort Bonifacio in size. It's the size of downtown Boston. 250,000 jobs created there, 65,000 permanent residents when it's finished. It's built with some of the finest architects in the United States. Jack Nicklaus designed the golf course. And it's designed to be Korea's equivalent to a Hong Kong or a Singapore. But what's most interesting about Songdo is that it's not designed to be part of Seoul, per se. Across that bridge you see in the distance, one of the world's longest, is Seoul Incheon International Airport, one of the world's busiest. Songdo is the classic example of an aerotropolis. It's not a city built around, necessarily next door to an airport, but it is a city that has nothing to do with its proximity to Seoul, which is 45 minutes away. It's a city that has everything to do with its airport and the connectivity and the connections offered by it. In fact, this is from the original sales document by its American developers, Gale International, which basically showed that the whole premise of Songdo is come live there and you can fly anywhere. And it was designed to be sold to American and other multinational corporations and their workers who could live here in a city that reminded them of home, a city that was designed with a Central Park like Manhattan's, a canal like Venice, an opera house like Sydney's, and then fly to anywhere they needed to in Asia. 2 hours to Tokyo, 2 hours to Beijing, under 3 hours to Shanghai. So the whole premise, again, of Songdo is that you could simply connect to anywhere in the world or anywhere in Northeast Asia if you settled there. So in light of the cities that we're building, is this the way we'll live next, in these massive cities that are being built around airports from scratch, reminiscent of the ones that we already live in? Well, I think before we can answer that question, I think it's important to look at how we've always lived in the past. And so, for example, the original trade routes, the most valuable trade route in the world, was Manila-Acapulco, the Spanish treasure fleets that connected from the Chinese tea and porcelain trade, the equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars today, boarded onto junks off the east coast of China, and then shipped over to Manila Bay, where they were then boarded onto the Spanish galleons and sent off for the New World. And it was these Spanish galleons that basically provided the wealth that sort of funded Europe and went from there. It was those biannual armadas that basically created the impetus to create Imperial Manila, the original shape of the city. And so what I'm arguing in the book, Aerotropolis, is that basically just as we once built cities around harbors and around docks, around the tea trade, the only difference today between a galleon that can hold 1,000 people and a FedEx 747 that can hold 100 tons of cargo, or an A380 that can hold 600 people today, is the scope and the scale at which we are conducting these operations. Globalization has always been with us. It's just that today it is the 777 of Emirates or whoever else is flying here to Clark that will bind us just as the galleons once did. And so to take a step back, when we talk about globalization, what is it we're talking about? I mean, the most bloodless way to describe it is to look at flows of finance. So here's a chart showing globalization, showing how world trade and GDP and foreign direct investment have soared over the last few decades. But this doesn't give you a sense of what it actually looks and feels like, where that money goes. It's not distributed evenly across the landscape. We don't all get our fair share of that. And so I would argue that if you want to look at the trade routes, just as they were once galleons, today it is air freight and passengers. And as you can see here, that basically air cargo, the amounts of air freight aloft, rises in lockstep with what we think of as globalization, the trade of manufactured goods. A third of all the goods traded in the world today by value, how much we're willing to pay for them, what they're worth to us, travels by air. And it comprises only 1% of the weight. So the most valuable, the most beloved things we have, those are the things that we are increasingly shipping by air, and that's growing much faster than what's going by boat. And the same goes for passengers as well. You can see that for the last 4 decades, despite every crisis, the original oil shock, 1979, the Gulf War, the Iraq War, SARS, all of the crises that have befallen us, air travel continues to rise. We've really not yet begun to fly as a species, essentially. This chart shows you the sort of curve, that basically as you become wealthier, the more likely you are to fly. And so as you become wealthier, you move towards the right, you fly more and more often. And the average today is higher than the number of people who fly in China or India or Brazil or Russia, the BRIC, or the tip of Thailand, Indonesia, the Philippines, or Vietnam, or any of them. We're still just seeing the beginnings of this aerial revolution. We've really not yet begun to fly. And so what's interesting to me as an American particularly is that I live in a place where we consider the golden age of air travel to be over. It's a painful, horrible experience, and prices are rising because of oil. And so I encounter all the time in the United States audiences that are very skeptical of this vision. And then I show them this chart because it shows that even though prices rise, you're less likely to travel, but that air travel is primarily a function of rising incomes. The wealthier you're becoming, the more valuable your time becomes, and so therefore the more likely you are to fly. You're not willing to take a slow boat anymore, and you're not just limited to your city or your village. You're now actually boarding flights. You're connecting to people across the country or across the world. And so, as you earlier, we saw growth estimates of 8% of GDP for the Philippines next year. I would imagine then that according to this metric, that we'll see air travel rates of 17% or higher. That basically the wealthier you become, the faster and more likely you are to fly too. It rises ahead of GDP. And the same thing is true for air cargo. This is a bit of a technical graph, but this shows that the reason we send goods via air is not because it's cheaper than ocean freight. Obviously it's not, or getting cheaper over time. We send it because the things that we make, that we imbue with our ideas, is becoming ever more valuable. And so what it costs to ship them via the air falls over time. We're building today, instead of cheap rotary phones, we're building $500 iPhones, and those all go by air from China and beyond. And that's why you can end up with an odd graph like this. This shows basically air cargo rising over time compared to oil prices. I always show this in the States because everyone thinks that we're about to reach the end of the globalization, that jobs are going to come back to the US and elsewhere, and it's never true. You can see here that there is no relationship between flying and oil prices. We will continue to fly no matter what. And so I mentioned the iPhone 5. This today is sort of, the ultimate sort of example of a global good. Manufactured in China right now in the famous Shenzhen Foxconn plant where 500,000 workers are, and then shipped to US customers, or customers here, anyone who can watch their phone being delivered via air, via Apple's website. What's interesting to me about this phone is that most of the value doesn't stay in China. This is something we grapple with in the United States. About $500, basically $5 accrues to the Chinese companies making it. The rest ends up at home, at retail, the people selling it. And the other half, another $250, goes to the suppliers, the companies who are making the components that go into the iPhone. And so you can see in this chart, I don't know how well you can see it, intermediate goods. Those are the components. Those are the fastest rising things going via the air. Those are the sub-assemblies, the microchips, the components being made here at Clark by companies like Texas Instruments and Samsung. Those are the goods that are flying all over Asia to be assembled at the last minute in a Chinese factory and then shipped to the United States. And even that factory may well soon move, as you've heard earlier this morning. And so you can see that basically more and more components are aloft. We're seeing an incredible amount of manufacturing that's moving via the air all the time. And so that famous Foxconn plant, that builds the iPhone, immortalized in these photos by Ed Pertansky, it's moving away from the Chinese coast. Wages are rising. Many companies are disenchanted, and it's going to go in one of two places. It could either come across back to ASEAN, or it could go, if China has its way, to the Western China, which is interesting in light of this graph. This shows the economic center of the Earth. So if you could imagine, all the sort of forces tugging at wherever the center of global wealth is. In 1980, the United States was pulling in its direction from Europe, but then it started to go into reverse. In 2007, it was somewhere over Egypt, and by 2049, the economic center of the Earth will be over Western China. In fact, it will more or less be over this city, Chongqing. You may know Chongqing. It's described as the fastest growing city on the planet. It calls itself the Chicago of the East. I'm from Chicago, so I always think of this. Chicago is famous 100 years ago or more of being the windy city and growing faster than any city since. And Chongqing is growing at 8 times that speed. It's a city of 32 million people on paper. It's only about 6 million people are there. But it's adding 300,000 people a year, which is the equivalent of the city of Pittsburgh back in the United States. And it has the fastest growing GDP in China, 17%. A fifth of all the laptops and tablets in the world are now made in Chongqing, and it's growing faster than any other region in China. This is remarkable considering that Chongqing is 1,000 miles upriver from Shanghai. It's famously cut off from the rest of the world. This is where they moved the wartime capital when Japan invaded China in 1931, because the Japanese bombers couldn't reach Chongqing, or only barely. And today, because of the airport they've invested, it's now shipping out a fifth of all the laptops in the world. It's a city in its current form that was only made possible via its investments in aviation that allowed manufacturing to move there. This is a diagnostic put out by McKinsey. This I find really interesting because it really sort of draws in the stakes of where we're going with the future of cities. McKinsey argues that over the next 15 to 20 years, a third of all the growth in the world, economic, will go to just 100 cities. And the next third of that will go to 500 more. And the remainder will be scattered among the rest. So 600 cities, this is the fat head on the long tail of cities that will basically determine which cities will be winners and losers. And McKinsey looked into it. You'd think that the winners would be mega cities like Chongqing, the biggest and the best. And that's not necessarily true. That McKinsey found that it's not a question of the biggest cities. There will be those mega cities in the developing world that will triumph, but the majority will be smaller ones. They'll be between 1 million and 10 million people, which means that the best cities of the future, the ones that will likely win, are not necessarily the biggest. They're the most connected. Where do you fit into the global supply chain of talent and goods and capital? How do you attract foreign direct investment? How do you project your talent onto the world? How do you become a great place to live and work? Those are the questions that every city is grappling with, where they fit into this pecking order. And so investments in education, investments in infrastructure, investments in regulation to make themselves attractive, those are the ones that are going to win. we're seeing a contraction. The hubs are getting hubbier, I like to say. And this, you can again see, this is the air hubs in the United States, where we're seeing contraction, where we're watching air service shrink there as the major airlines consolidate. And so fewer and fewer communities have those vital connections. And that's the opposite situation you face here in the Philippines, fortunately, because of the revolution in low-cost carriers and that emerging middle class. So you have the opportunities that we, in fact, in the United States do not. So just to give you an example of what this looks like and how it evolves over time, I think it's only fair to evoke Dubai and to some extent Doha because of Emirates coming here. I like to call Dubai as essentially an airline with an emirate attached. It was one of the first businesses that Dubai set up in 1985 as the centerpiece of its future strategy. Sheikh Mohammed used Emirates Airline and appointed his uncle, Sheikh Ahmed, to basically run the airline, the National Aeronautics Board, and the airports together as a finely tuned piece of machinery, of political machinery, to basically win an investment. So Dubai's whole strategy of tourism, trade, logistics, all of that was sort of founded on Emirates. And so, 10 years ago, you can see here that the two main airlines in the Middle East were mostly regional carriers with some international connections, including Manila. But 10 years later, they're joined by a third airline, Etihad, out of Abu Dhabi. And now these three airlines have combined to create a single hub for the entire center of the world. You can fly from anywhere to anywhere else, whether from Manchester to Sydney, or you can fly from Dhaka to Manila. And starting next year, you can fly from Lagos to Clark. And so suddenly you have this incredible machinery to pump millions of people through the center of the world. Dubai, a place that was a little backwater 20 years ago, is now occupying the commanding heights of the global trade lanes. They're calling this the New Silk Road. So if you want to see the crossroads of the New Silk Road, I highly recommend you stop over in Dubai at midnight. More people are passing through that airport at 2 in the morning than they do during the day. And you will find Emiratis returning from shopping trips. You will find Indian traders bound for Africa. You'll find Chinese laborers bound for Africa themselves to build the massive infrastructure that's going to make Africa's growth possible. And if you're on the hunt for Chinese goods, you don't even need to go to China. You can stop over at Dragon Mart. This is the largest wholesale trading hub owned by the Chinese outside of China. 4,000 shops is basically where all the sort of Chinese goods are passed into Central Asia and onto Africa. I was there a few years ago, and you basically can see people from Kinshasa and Harare, all these cities from landlocked Africa, who are shopping for the latest cell phones, things I'd never thought possible. And what's interesting is that they're now building a sequel to Dragon Mart across the street that's 3 times its size. So that's the sort of incarnate, that's the sort of physical approximation of numbers like this, where 10 years ago, Chinese exports to the Arab world were to $6 billion. The United States was $48 billion. 10 years later, China's exports to the Arab world are $60 billion, and the United States is $54 billion. In just a decade, the United States had been surpassed there. And that's happening even more so in ASEAN. I mean, here's a place where, China's trade to ASEAN exports was $7 billion in 1990. Last year, it was $292 billion. And this year, China has overtaken the United States as the world's largest trading nation with a $2.87 trillion in exports and trade compared to $2.8 trillion by the United States. China is now, for example, the largest trading partner of 124 nations. And I don't know if the Philippines accounts for that as well, but I wouldn't be surprised. And so again, this was all made possible by China's investments in aviation and Dubai's as well. So what is Dubai doing now? It's building a second airport. In addition to Dubai International, which is one of the world's top 3 busiest. This is Al Maktoum International, named after the ruling sheikh. It doesn't look like much now. It's a single runway with plans to eventually go to as many as 6. And picking up on what John was mentioning about the connection between Subic and Clark, this is exactly what Dubai is doing with the megaport at Jebel Ali, the world's largest man-made harbor, and its new airport. It's creating a single bonded customs area where you can basically take in cargo from the port and move it through seamlessly for shipment out. This is interesting because normally you don't do sea-air combinations. It's very difficult to do, very difficult to make it price sensitive. But here it's made it possible for, again, African merchants I mentioned, among many others, to ship goods via China on the slow route and much less cheaper into Dubai and then fly it to all points within Africa and Central Asia, all these landlocked nations that have struggled to grow. It's changed the economic geography of both the Middle East and the center of the world. And it's not just goods that are going in. This air connectivity has allowed the Middle East to basically put forth incredibly ambitious plans when it comes to tourism and education. So Abu Dhabi is building a whole island filled with museums, a Guggenheim designed by Frank Gehry and a branch of the Louvre from Paris. It turns out that for $1 billion you can franchise the Louvre. The art, however, is extra. That's another $500 million if you want to borrow their art. But that's sort of the example of like what Abu Dhabi is doing, as well as a Formula One racetrack, as well as a Ferrari theme park, and as well as a branch of one of my own institutions. I'm a visiting scholar at NYU, and they've actually created their own campus in Abu Dhabi. And so you can basically, instead of having to travel to the United States, if you're one of the most best and the brightest students in Africa or the Middle East, you can simply fly to Abu Dhabi instead. And Doha is doing the same. They built an entire education city, which is based around their airport, which is their new one opens later this year and begins opening in April. They're pursuing an Aerotropolis strategy by their own admission, and they're bringing in pieces of world-class universities, again, to do the same thing, to basically corner the market on talent before it ever has a chance to go overseas. The UAE has its own export, however, and in this case it's not oil but hospital patients. Several of the speakers have mentioned medical tourism. I've written about it and explored it. What I find interesting is that medical tourism began, at least from my perspective as an American, of people going overseas for inexpensive cosmetic surgery, dentistry, sort of lower value and simpler surgery. But it wasn't until Dubai and Abu Dhabi signed a contract with hospitals in Thailand to simply send their patients, their civil servants. It was cheaper for them to ship them via air to Bangkok for medical treatment than it was to build hospitals in Dubai, at least in the beginning. And so it was this hospital, Bumrungrad International, became the world's first to have more overseas patients than domestic ones. It's a private hospital. It accepts mostly in cash, doesn't really take in health insurance. But what's interesting about Bumrungrad to me is that essentially you can get surgery that would cost $60,000 or $80,000 in the United States, and you can do it for a tenth of the price. And that started becoming a world magnet for both doctors and patients alike. Both that and its rival across town, Bangkok General, where you can see 30 different nationalities are now there flying for medical service. Now, what's interesting about them is while they're fine hospitals, no one ever really thought to go there until you had that sort of air connectivity. They're piggybacking off of Thailand's incredible tourism infrastructure. And as India has strove to compete with them, creating new hospital chains like Apollo and Fortis, they've had to realize that same infrastructure. So I had the conversation with Vishal Bali. He's the CEO of Fortis, which is now a chain that involves, I think, something like 40 or 50 hospitals. It's actively in medical tourism. And what he told me is that what they were doing was never possible until the BPO industry came to Bangalore, where they're headquartered. And I was like, what do you mean the BPO industry? What does that have to do with hospitals? And he explained to me that all of those Americans and other companies who are flying to Bangalore to keep tabs on their BPO outsourcers to set up these operations had created enough seats and created enough air passenger service that they could then begin marketing to hospital patients. It was that connectivity that made it possible for medical tourism to begin setting up and expanding in India. And I thought that was fascinating. It was an unintended consequence of a whole other industry that had created that air demand in the first place. And so now you're seeing Indian doctors are now leaving the United States to go back home, where they can basically pursue top-notch cutting-edge science. When I was at Bangkok General, I met the head of their heart clinic, who told me that he was able to use techniques like stem cells injected directly into cardiac tissue that he couldn't do in the US. And he taught heart surgery at the University of Minnesota for 26 years. So I see this is a fantastic opportunity for the Philippines, which is world-renowned for its nurses and its staff, who are all toiling overseas, the overseas forward workers, for the Philippines to use that air connectivity to begin setting up in earnest its own medical travel industry. There is nothing holding it back once you have that connectivity. Now, what does it mean to actually build an Aerotropolis? I've talked mostly about sort of air service in general. Well, the premise of the book, and this is what I set out to figure out when I began writing it, is that if we once build cities around our ports and around railroads, and if air travel is really the only form of global connectivity that works, well, sooner or later we should start seeing businesses and people setting up cities around airports. And sure enough, that was the case. Songdo is a very planned one. Clark has plans to do it as well. But organically, it happened as much as 100 years ago, or close to it, 90 years ago in Los Angeles. And we still see, when you talk to businesses, what they want in where to place headquarters and other high-level functions. They want to be near major connecting hubs. This is showing some of the best cities in Europe. Stockholm and Helsinki are two of my favorite cities on the planet. But if I were setting up a business, I would rather be in Frankfurt, which has more air connections than any city city on the planet. And if you do that, you can set up in this building right here. This is the Square, as it's called. It's a landscraper. It's longer than the Empire State Building is tall. It's probably close to the Petronas Towers. And it sits on top of Frankfurt's high-speed rail hub, as well as next to its airport. It's perhaps the best connected piece of real estate in all of Europe. And that's why KPMG Europe, the accounting firm, consolidated all of its offices in this building, 2,500 accountants, as well as many other sort of corporate offices. It's an example when you look at how airports evolve. You know, this is a building that sits right next to the airport, almost inside the fence. And over time, as you've seen, planners at Frankfurt and Schiphol and elsewhere have seen this model emerge, where you start by redeveloping the area inside your airport, adding new concessions in the terminals, duty-free shopping, additional functions, and then over time, you can start to see the area develop. You can start adding parking and hotels, all sorts of activities around the airport that generate revenue that allow you to keep investing in it, that goes beyond just simply relying on the airlines. And then over time, you begin planning the area around it to make it more efficient, and you end up with an airport city, or the Aerotropolis. And the first to really do that worldwide were the Dutch at Schiphol, the main airport for Amsterdam. This is in the background is the World Trade Center, which has the headquarters of 4 Fortune Global 500 companies, including Airbus. Which you'd expect, but not Danone, which is a dairy company, but they choose to set up their headquarters there as well. And the Dutch developed this model where you basically have this synergistic loop. The money generated by the airport allows you to invest in businesses outside of the airport and vice versa, and so you can sort of create this catalyst to keep expanding. And so in Amsterdam, in its case, Schiphol set up 2 different real estate companies, one to manage inside the fence and one to coordinate with the broader community, the various cities around it, and also real estate companies. And so Schiphol is unique in the sense that, although it acts like a corporation, it's actually also owned by 7 different municipalities. And so it's allowed to pursue a very aggressive strategy without interference from its neighbors, as opposed to trying to strangle it or crack down on the noise. And so Schiphol has been very good at being able to move businesses around and land use plan and basically create the most optimal mix of businesses, industrial and office, in its very small space and it can. And this is why Schiphol has the highest industrial rents of any place in the Netherlands, higher than Amsterdam or the Rotterdam or the Hague. And it also has some of the highest office rents, and in fact led to the creation of its own Aerotropolis just down the road. This is called the Zaitis. It was designed from scratch to be the headquarters for several of the Netherlands' largest financial services firms. This is where you'll find the headquarters of what remains of ABN AMRO, its largest bank until it was bought, but also of ING, one of the world's largest insurance companies, Akzo Nobel, one of the world's largest chemical companies, and so forth. And this sits 6 minutes via train, 10 minutes via car from Schiphol. That highway and train line you see in the middle of it runs directly to the airport and will eventually be buried underground, so they could add more towers on top of it. What's interesting is that the Zaitis was built after the government had asked those largest companies to move their headquarters to a new city north of Amsterdam, a whole new CBD, and they balked because it was far too far from Schiphol. And so they built the Zaitis instead. And you can see its success as measured in the form of office rents. Again, the Zaitis has higher rents than even Schiphol and higher than anywhere else in the Netherlands. So there is an actual concrete value to the connectivity offered by the airport, and you can realize it in the form of these rents and other forms of real estate development and so forth. You know, that it's real. And this is going on in the United States in various forms too. It's spreading out from here. So this is an aerial of Atlanta, still the world's busiest airport until Beijing overtakes it later this year. I don't know if you can see in the upper right there, that sort of sandy spot was a former Ford Fairlane plant. It was an auto plant that sat there for 80 years. Until recently, an Atlanta-based developer tore the whole site apart, 1.5 million square feet, and replanned it. Instead of a decaying, polluting industrial site, has replanted as a sort of new office mixed-use retail development project called Aerotropolis Atlanta, which in addition to hopefully creating 15,000 jobs, will include the new headquarters of Porsche North America, which relocated from the suburbs to be closer to the airport because you have nonstop flights from Frankfurt via Lufthansa, and then they're able to connect to more cities in the United States than any other airport. So that connectivity they offered to them was the most valuable in their decision of where to relocate. In Denver, Mayor Michael Hancock has decided to build an Aerotropolis at their airport. If you're familiar, Denver was the last major airport built in the United States in 1995, probably the last major airport we will ever build in the States. It was built on 50 square miles of grassland, so no one could ever build too close, which at the time was a great idea. No one can get close enough to complain. But now they're realizing that all this empty land has potential value as businesses crowd up to it, and so now they're trying to find new uses and develop, and there's going to be a whole new train line that runs out to the airport as well, with this station designed by Calatrava. So you can see they're embracing an Aerotropolis strategy. And if you want to see the value of what air connectivity can do to a city and a region, Denver is one of the busiest airports in the United States, but it was almost purely domestic, had no international service beyond a single flight to London. They were desperate for years to have a flight to Asia, which United has finally given them. Once the Dreamliners are flying again, they're going to start service from Denver to Tokyo. And by their own estimates, that single nonstop flight, their first to Asia, will create $142 million in trickle-down investments. And this has been seen time and time again. In Atlanta, for example, I was told that, that once they started service to Tokyo, the amount of real estate taken up by Japanese companies in Atlanta went from effectively 0 to 10 million square feet in a decade. So you can see mass investment once this is opened up. And this is going on and on throughout the United States. And it's interesting how it's evolved. Denver was an example where Denver had a perfectly fine airport that was close to the city, Stapleton, that eventually choked on its own growth. It was impossible to expand. People literally lived under the runways until finally they negotiated to close it and move the airport out to Denver International. But many other cities have found it very advantageous to have a two-airport model, like Manila does, and potentially with Clark. In that case, where you have a sort of city, an airport within the city used for some domestic traffic and also high-value international, with the larger airport further out handling international flights and lower costs. And the quintessential example of that, I think, if there's a twin to Naya, it's Ronald Reagan in Washington D.C. DCA. This is where everyone wants to fly into in Washington, and therefore it's incredibly restricted. But what's interesting is that, again, in the case of DCA, you can see in the 1970s a whole master plan city went in from scratch across the street called Crystal City. It's a forest of hotels and retail. It's quite ugly, I think, as you can see there. But it also has, and it's probably too small to see, Crystal City has the lowest vacancy rates and the highest asking per square foot of any office district in the entire Northern Virginia, Washington, D.C. environs. It is the most exclusive business real estate in that whole area. And so this is why they're basically using this as an excuse to redevelop the area around Crystal City. There are now plans afoot to densify it, make it more beautiful, make it a real urban place as opposed to this hotel district next to the airport. So if they succeed in these plans, you're going to see parks and plazas and more residential and something that resembles a real city. And I think this can be very much a model for Clark and other places that are trying to develop real cities, real urban fabric, as opposed to simply forests of warehouses, which is traditionally what ends up around airports. And this is even more interesting. This is Northern Virginia going west from Reagan. IAD is Dulles International Airport, built in the 1960s. It laid very fallow for 20 years, just as Clark did after that. Supposedly in the 1980s, you could hear your own footsteps in the terminal in the afternoons, until finally service began picking up. It was the location of Dulles beyond Washington, D.C. that allowed Northern Virginia to become this huge expanse of office and retail. Tyson's Corner, as you see there, would be the 6th largest city in the United States in terms of office and retail, if you counted it by that alone. And Reston up there is one of the largest master plan cities in the United States that was designed from scratch to have that sort of urban fabric that was missing from there as well. And just this year, we were discussing the rail links and necessity for it. For years, there was no rail links out to Dulles. You had the Dulles Toll Road was what unlocked all of that value, and now finally they're extending the DC Metro out, the Silver Line, that will run out to the airport and run under Tyson's, which will go from being a forest of malls and congestion to a more tightly bound 24/7 city. So you can see this evolution over time. And again, I asked the head of economic development in Fairfax County, which has Tyson's Corner, the role that Dulles played in it, and he just laughed and said, "We sit between a major international airport and Washington, D.C. We'd have to try to screw this up." And so they were able to do that. And this pattern has played out again and again and again historically, and this is why I put some truth in it. It goes beyond attempts to plan. You will sooner or later sprout an Aerotropolis in some form if you have enough connectivity. This is what happened in Los Angeles. This is what happened in Chicago. In the 1930s, Midway was the busiest airport in the world, back when it was still DC-3 propeller planes. And then in 1959, there was a decision to move most of the service out to O'Hare, which has been expanded, and to build a new Northwest Tollway that ran out there, as well as the Kennedy Expressway. And suddenly, you had a massive surge of growth out to O'Hare. It became known as the Golden Corridor, and this is where Motorola and Sears set up their headquarters and basically unlocked the Northwest suburbs, which is still the highest growth area area in Chicago today. And internationally, this has happened as well overseas. Tokyo is an interesting example where the government, basically built Narita as its sort of far-out hub, and it has failed to develop as well as O'Hare has. But that's what's interesting, because they built Narita, they were able to really sort of save Haneda, which I think could be really the model for Naiya once you sort of built this two-airport system. Haneda, was limited to being domestic traffic and struggled for years, and now is being gradually reopened to international service. So Narita serves this function as the main international gateway and hub where you can process huge amounts of people on a very large site that's very unobstructed. And Haneda is your place where you can basically bring people into the capital on expensive business flights and whatnot else. They serve a very, very complementary purpose. And this is being repeated in Shanghai as well, where Pudong opened, in the last 15 years, has become the sort of major international gateway for Shanghai. And Hongqiao, traditionally the city's close-in airport, is now being redeveloped by Vincent Lo, who has developed dozens of shopping centers, major multi-million square foot shopping centers across China, is now developing it into a huge intermodal transportation terminal and mixed-use development with a value in the billions, and basically using that passenger traffic to redevelop this huge site around it. So the ultimate example of a two-port strategy, and I'll be fascinated to see how this works, will be Beijing, where capital city on the north side of the city is set to, as I mentioned, become the busiest in the world sometime this year. It will overtake Atlanta. But that hasn't stopped the Chinese, where they're now building on the south side of the city, on a site that I can't see yet on satellite maps, an airport with capacity for 200 million people, which is approximately 2 to 3 times larger than any airport that exists now. And so you can see that China is still betting its future on aviation, and there's plans to integrate Langfang, that city you see in the south, into this larger Aerotropolis they're building. So China has, of course, been on a massive construction spree with airports. The goal is to have an airport, a major airport, within 90 minutes driving distance of every major city. And they have spent hundreds of millions of dollars to sort of expand access to that as part of their way of opening up to the world. So I find this fascinating that, China, of course, the Middle Kingdom, a place that was closed to outsiders for thousands of years, is now embracing it with a vengeance. And this, of course, is, one of many opportunities offered to the Philippines. This whole, this society of a billion people who spend $85 billion a year last year in overseas shopping alone for you to attract. And so with that, I'll conclude, and I'm available for signing out here and to answer any questions. But I guess my remark is that, there is a historical pattern at work here that will work potentially in favor of Clark. The fact that Air Asia and Emirates are both coming here shows that there's real commercial interest in this, and that there will be service expanding. And so you have an opportunity to plan for it, because many airports did not, and they sooner or later found themselves in conflict with their surrounding cities over noise, over pollution, over quality of life. And so it's up to a progressive city to figure out how it will work with its airport, how it will complement it to bring in these flows of trade and tourism versus fighting it. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Greg. That was a magnificent round-the-world trip of... now we all know what Aerotropolis means. Hey, don't go away. Wait. You're not getting off that easily. Come on.
I thought I would escape.
Okay, we want Greg to expand on some of these thoughts for us. Who has some questions? We're going to hold him here until we get some questions. The book is on sale at the National Bookstore booth outside here. Greg's here all afternoon, and he'll personally sign your book copies for you. Okay, I'll start with the first question. This all sounds fabulous, really fabulous, and you've got some great examples of airports generating economic growth, building cities in direct relation to the airport. The corollary of that, I think, is in many places where airports want to expand, the communities are wholly against expansion. Right? So in one case, in the futuristic or the current and future scenario is you build the city connected with the airport. In the old-fashioned model, when you want to do an airport expansion, I'm thinking London Heathrow in particular, I'm thinking Hong Kong where I'm based at the moment, it's really difficult. The communities are dead against it. What's the dichotomy there?
Well, I mean, that's sort of traditionally the thing. Particularly in the United States, I always found that, that basically cities would try to banish their airports to the edge of the city and then surround them with polluting industries. The number of auto plants, cement plants, and other heavy industry around airports that I found always surprises me because it's sort of the worst industry suited toward taking advantage of the airports. I always like to say that, that in most cases we built our airports before we knew what they were before. And, in the case of Los Angeles, for example, they originally chose the site of LAX. In 1929, it was a bean field that was a mile square, and then they had to fight to expand it. And that was a city where the original lawsuits against noise that would bedevil airports around the world for decades after that first went into place. And so you see this all over, this dichotomy of love-hate, where people are rely on their airport, rely on the connectivity it offers for their economy, and then they fight it all the way. And that's often because they built it on sites that were much too small to ever accommodate them. NAIA is no different. And again, coming back to Chicago O'Hare, which is not one of the smallest footprints, they're having to spend upwards of somewhere between $5 and $20 billion to rearrange the runways to get away from those sort of cross runways that NAIA has, and move into a pattern that's able to sustain the growth that Chicago requires. And it was fascinating to me that the last mayor of Chicago, Mayor Daley, who was famously, he and his father were mayor for decades, his last act in office was to negotiate that expansion, and his act after that was to go to China to look for investors to build a high-speed rail link from downtown Chicago to the airport, because it still doesn't have one. I mean, this is an airport with 60 million passengers a year, and they've gotten by all this time without a high-speed rail link, although he realizes its importance. So it's interesting. If you don't plan for it, if you don't have that room to expand, sooner or later you will find yourself in a bind, and then there are no good options, as London is finding out right now.
Okay, great, thanks. Anybody, this gentleman here, please, sir, just give us your name and organization, please.
Hi, I'm Bob Wagner from the Robert T. Wagner Foundation.
Bob.
If you're from Chicago, you remember what Daley Jr. did to Meigs Field?
Yes.
Okay, he just went in one day and said, we're going to bulldoze the runways and tear them all up. Well, friends of mine actually had a couple of King Airs on the field at the time, and they were forced to take off on the taxiways to get out of town. And here in the Philippines, the CAAP are shutting down a lot of small airfields. And they seem to be concentrating on wanting the larger hub, NAIA, Clark, and so forth and so on. In some of the other countries, especially in the United States, they're using the regional airports, even some of the smaller municipal airports, and they're starting to connect them with the CRJs, okay, the regional jets. And I just want your opinion as to whether or not that type of system is doable in Asia, and especially here in the Philippines.
That's a great question. Yes and no. I don't think the CRJ, the regional jets, as we're referring to, very small seat, 50-seat planes. I don't think regional jets have much of a future at this point. They're very costly to operate. What I do see, though, is an example of that is, and there's several new startups in the United States that are doing this. One company called Surf Air, where they're using much smaller planes operating out of those regional airports to basically bypass large hubs. So, in the United States, we have 20,000 airfields, although 88% of our traffic is concentrated in just 100 or I think something like 150. And so there's this incredible availability of airfields if you can find out planes to use them. So if I was labeled a futurist when I got on here. One of the things I think is fascinating in the future is looking at a combination of drones, of pilotless aircraft, electric aircraft, propeller planes. So in the future, we could see very small planes, very cheap planes, taking off from these small airfields and delivering 4 or 5 people at a time to larger hubs, where then they could board flights for Hong Kong or Taipei or elsewhere. So it'll be very curious. We've seen the air industry over time, particularly in nations where it's more advanced, like the United States, where it gets bigger and bigger planes and more efficient. But I think in developing nations, the developing world, in Asia, you have this possibility of much smaller planes, especially on an island chain like the Philippines, 7,000 islands. You could very cheaply operate a whole fleet of domestic pilotless aircraft that could connect people who'd never had that before. So that's one futuristic scenario. But I know there are many smart people at NASA working on this.
Okay, good. Any other questions or comments? Lady up the back there, thank you.
Marianne Karandang from Travel Trade Gazette, or TTG Asia, travel trade publication based in Singapore. I'd just like to know if you have any specific observations regards to Clark's potential as an aerotropolis in the context of tourism. What should Clark do, maybe tactically and then strategically, to improve itself as a destination?
Thank you, Mariam.
That is the $64,000 question, $64 million question. Well, several things. I mean, one of the things that I like about Clark that I think is very promising about it versus airports in the United States, where I've actually, in several cases, spoken out against airports in the United States that proclaim themselves to be an Aerotropolis. Cities like St. Louis, which wanted to spend $360 million on taxpayer funds to lure Chinese cargo carriers. It was a plan that was never really going to work, and it struck me as they were throwing away money because fundamentally the service wasn't there. Those Chinese companies did not want to go to St. Louis. They wanted to go to Chicago or Dallas. And so throwing money at them to come there was ultimately unsustainable. And so therefore Clark has the first prerequisite of an Aerotropolis. It has commercial air service and growing service from committed carriers. And so I was telling someone yesterday that the fact that Tony Fernandez of AirAsia and Tim Clark of Emirates is betting on Clark, to me is the most promising sign that there's something there. But with that air service in mind, I mean, the next thing I think you need is you need a strong land use plan. You need to definitively say and lay out exactly how development can occur, so therefore you can have some assurances to the business community and potential investors that they know where to build and what to build. And this is something we're seeing in places like Songdo and elsewhere, where there's incredible government involvement. And then, essentially the third thing is you basically need a finer meshing of policy and economics and at the actual airport. I mean, places like Dubai and Songdo and elsewhere, when I wrote about them, one of the things I found is that they were policy engines. They were designed by these governments in hands with private investors to be competitive trade zones. I describe Songdo as a weapon for fighting trade wars. It sits in the middle of a free zone, the Incheon Free Economic Zone, where English is the official language to encourage multinationals to set up there. And everything in it is designed to basically make business easier and faster to do. And that's what Dubai has done famously in all of its free zones. So I mean, the Clark Free Zone is a great step. I don't know what else specifically you can do in terms of policy, but there needs to be this meshing of transportation and economics and politics so the three can work most complementary together, because otherwise you're competing with places like Shenzhen. You're competing with places that give incentives. I mean, it's a difficult race, but infrastructure can only take you so far. So.
Okay, man. Thank you for your question. I've got one final point, if nobody else has got one. I've got one final point. I'll ask you just to expand a bit on the connectedness and how important this is. You referenced the McKinsey 600 Cities of the Future, and one of your charts said size matters, but the network effect matters more. Yeah. Enlighten us a bit more about this network effect, because I think that's a critical potential avenue for Clark to generate for the future.
Well, yeah,
the network effect concept.
I mean, that network effect ties back into, I think it's a combination of air networks, obviously, as we were discussing, but also that sort of clustering effect that we see in industry after industry. And this goes back to the heart of sort of urban economics, that once you start getting this agglomeration of industries, it becomes easier and easier for other companies in the same area to set up around it, and you get that sort of expertise that spawns off of it. I mean, this is why Dongguan and Shenzhen, mentioned earlier, are these massive manufacturing hubs. I mean, there was government policy at the beginning to create these free zones, but over time it was that knowledge base and it was that investment potential that allowed Shenzhen to go from making shoes and garments to making the iPhone 5. And that goes beyond simply Apple setting up shop there. There's literally millions of workers there now who have experience in building those components, who are in some cases setting up their own companies, and now we're seeing domestic rivals to the iPhone. China may well have the next great smartphone, and Samsung has seen the same thing in Korea. So, considering all the suppliers are now, are potentially in play again, where there's this opportunity to get some of that business, that's the sort of thing you need here. Well, what industries are you best at? What do you do best? What is your core competency as a region, and can build these sort of agglomerations around, and then using air travel to reinforce that. And that's what every region is sort of, focused on today. In the United States, for example, Brookings published, the Brookings Institution, a think tank, published a great report on exports, and it noted that every city in the United States, no matter how much it was struggling, like a Cleveland or Detroit, has incredible reserves of industry there that they can maximize. And that's true of Clark, and that's true of every city in the Philippines, whether it's tourism or BPOs and beyond. And so, what can you do to accentuate what you have and create a hub here that you can use your air networks to tie into? And so it goes just beyond the number of seats daily.
Greg Lindsay, journalist, urbanist, and speaker, thank you so much for being with us today.